1968. It was a year of living dangerously and dying tragically.
Martin Luther King, 20 minutes ago, died.
A year when Americans witnessed the summer of love turn into the days of rage.
America was a totalitarian state, and we were the enemy.
In popular music led the sound of a revolution.
A lot of us were living out Bob Dylan lyrics, you know, we're living out Rolling Stones songs.
We lived in extremely interesting times. We reacted to it, you know.
It was a year of astonishing extremes for pain and for pleasure.
Sex became more than sex. Music became more than music. People became more than people.
It was a stupid, violent, ugly, thoughtless, selfish era during which I had a really good time.
A year when America itself seemed to teeter on the brink of self-destruction.
There were so many divisions in 1968, you couldn't even add them up.
And a year when a younger generation's fondest dreams and darkest nightmares all came true.
That's the power of youth, to have the nerve to think that we could change the world. We could change the world. What an idea.
Tonight, 1968, the year that shook the world and the music that rocked it.
If I were to pick a time in the whole history of man in which to live and a place in which to live, I'd pick the United States of America, 1968. This is the place, this is the time, and never forget it.
United States aircraft have resumed action in North Vietnam.
The events of 1968 tore across America with the force of a hurricane. And popular music was at the eye of every storm. For every headline, there was a song from artists like James Brown, Aretha Franklin, the Jefferson Airplane, and the Beatles.
We definitely wanted to write about things that meant something to somebody and that could possibly help them in this completely mad, chaotic world that America was at that time.
Young American soldiers were fighting in a civil war halfway around the world in a country called Vietnam and paying a heavy price. Nearly 10,000 U.S. troops had died there in 1967, and in 68, things would only get worse.
We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do.
The number one anthem of all the troops when I was there was Eric Burdon and the Animals, We Gotta Get Out of This Place. Anytime that we were in the rear and that song was played or came on, everyone would stop. Everyone would join in at the top of their lungs. It was just the best song.
By January 1968, Vietnam's Civil War had become America's civil crisis. By law, every man between the ages of 18 and 25 was required to register for the draft, but the poor were always the first to go.
It was very much as though the sergeant had come up to the front of the group and said, everybody whose dad made more than $20,000 a year and has been to college, get over here, you're out. You know, everybody whose dad made less than $20,000 a year didn't go to college, over here, you're in.
I mean, it was like a series of events that would all come true in my mind. I'll be drafted, I'll most certainly go in the Army, I'll most certainly be sent to Vietnam, and I will most certainly be killed.
John Fogerty was drafted in 1966. He didn't go to Vietnam, but he did serve 2 years in the Army. There, he says he witnessed the inequality of the draft firsthand. In '68, Fogerty was fronting a band called Creedence Clearwater Revival, writing songs which would later become anti-war anthems.
One day I got in my mind the idea of Fortunate Son, sort of a twist or a flip on the phrase favorite son. I don't know how I went from one to the other, but once I thought in terms of a fortunate son, I mean, all my venom came out.
Until early 1968, political and military leaders insisted that the war was going well. But more and more Americans were having their doubts.
They would tell you we lost 12 guys. And they would tell you the other side lost 2,000 guys. Pretty soon it seemed like, well, the other guys have lost 10 million guys and we've lost 30. Yet you're seeing these newsreels of devastation. And our army is being pushed back and not doing very well.
Then on January 30th, 1968, North Vietnamese and communist-backed guerrilla forces in South Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive.
The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong attack every single American military installation simultaneously in Vietnam and penetrate the perimeter of the American embassy in Saigon, and basically all hell breaks loose. And this causes an almost overnight revolution in the way America thinks about this war.
Tet Offensive finally convinced most Americans that the war was unwinnable. And the music became more and more a part of the anti-war movement as a result, I think.
It's all over for the unknown soldier.
The strange, delirious undertones of new music by bands like The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, and the Jefferson Airplane resonated in the jungles of Vietnam and swept across college campuses where students were exploring the links between mind-altering drugs and spiritual paths of knowledge.
One pill makes you larger, and one pill makes you small.
Psychedelia acid provided a certain outlaw capacity to the people who took it, but more importantly, it gave them a view of life that they hadn't had before.
To the counterculture, the Vietnam War wasn't just dangerous, it was absurd. And a military veteran and protest singer named Country Joe McDonald wrote a song that seemed to capture that dark vision.
1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam.
Well, to be perfectly blunt, the message of the song is F you. F you, Mr. President. F you, Department of Defense. F you, Commander-in-Chiefs. All you people. You want me to go out and die for something and you won't even explain it to me. You won't tell me what to do, just off.
The tune is called the I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die rag, and in '68 you'd hear it everywhere.
Music like Country Joe's helped us to stay sane.
Philip Butler was a fighter pilot who was shot down over North Vietnam. By 1968, he'd been a prisoner of war for 3 years and would endure 5 more before he was released. He was shackled with his fellow POWs at an infamous prison called the Hanoi Hilton. It was there he first heard the Fixin' to Die rag on a Viet Cong radio program of anti-war propaganda.
It's a very compelling tune and has great rhythm, and it has a nice black GI humor to it. Whoopee, we're all gonna die is pretty funny when you're sitting there in a situation like that. It rings very true for you.
After the Tet Offensive, the anti-war movement gathered momentum. 2 senators, Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, signed on and openly challenged President Lyndon Johnson for the 1968 Democratic nomination.
Good evening, my fellow Americans.
Then on March 31st, in a televised speech watched by 70 million people, Lyndon Johnson announced that he was withdrawing from the race.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Mass anti-war protests had helped bring about the demise of a once popular president, and music had fueled the crusade.
Sitting in the morning sun.
For a few precious hours, the peace movement savored their victory. No one imagined the firestorm about to break.
Look like nothing's gonna change. Everything still remains the same. I can't do what people tell me to do, so I guess I'll remain the same. People everywhere just wanna be free.
Next, a revered leader is killed, and a dream goes up in flames.
We're a winner.
During the mid-60s, the civil rights movement had become a powerful instrument for social change. And by '68, songs like Curtis Mayfield's We're a Winner were being played on radio stations across the country.
Black folks needed to hear that, and it helped, I suppose, in its own way with the struggle. And it wasn't even so much the depth of lyric, but we're moving on up. Lord have mercy, we're moving up.
In '68, it seemed music was building a bridge across the racial divide.
What was so exciting about 1968 was that you really felt like, because there were these black and white artists playing together and who we all worshipped together, you felt for this tiny moment that there was the possibility of genuine racial and sexual equality in America, which was something which we achieved on the radio but never really achieved for any lasting moment anywhere else.
Let us be willing to turn the other cheek with the realization that it is better to go through life with a scarred up body than with a scarred up soul.
As the war in Vietnam dragged on, Martin Luther King exerted his influence on behalf of the peace movement. More than any other national figure, he exuded a spiritual authority which transcended politics, generations, and race.
People get ready, have a train a-coming.
It's easy to forget that a lot of what 1968 was about was being anti-materialistic. Martin Luther King said it's time for us to move from being a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society.
In a country that seemed to be splitting at the seams, King was that rare figure who was still struggling to keep it together.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Then on April 4th, 1968, while standing on a motel balcony in Memphis, Martin Luther King was shot by a white man named James Earl Ray.
At 7:10 this evening, Martin Luther King was shot in Tennessee. Martin Luther King, 20 minutes ago, died.
As news of the assassination spread, expressions of anguish and sorrow gave way to a violent fury.
After Martin Luther King is assassinated, you have the worst riots in modern American history. You have machine gun nests on the steps of the Capitol. You have federal troops guarding the lawn of the White House.
Within 48 hours of King's death, 130 cities across America were scarred by looting and arson. Then Aretha Franklin admonished everyone to think. Deeply disturbed by Dr. King's death and the destruction which followed, Aretha wrote a song to bring a community back together.
Think about what you're trying to do to me. Think, let your mind go, let yourself be free. Oh, freedom, freedom, freedom.
You have to stand up and be counted for things that you believe in and what you feel is right. And that's what I did. Mm-hmm.
Public confrontations were becoming the order of the day. On April 26, 200,000 high school and college students across the U.S. boycotted class to protest the Vietnam War.
These were the children of the most privileged classes in America, and they were revolting against the system, and this was much more terrifying in a way to white middle-class America to see people just like themselves fighting with the police.
Beyond America, passion and protest raged in the streets of Paris, London, Mexico City, and Prague. Young people everywhere were challenging authority and the status quo. Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones captured that heady spirit of rebellion in Street Fighting Man.
That line, street fighting man everywhere, I hear the sound of marching chargers' feet. That was going on all around the world. Jagger went to a lot of street rallies in England at the time. There was a March 1968 rally at the American Embassy. English kids outraged at the pervasiveness of U.S. foreign policy in the world, and the quagmire that was Vietnam, and this kind of a thing. And Jagger was at that rally.
With Martin Luther King gone, Robert Kennedy's bid for president acquired a more emotional, even desperate aura. For many, Kennedy was the country's last hope.
He appealed to lower-class white people as well as blacks, as well as middle-class whites. He really had the capacity to build a kind of coalition.
Late in the evening of June 4th, at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, supporters were celebrating Robert Kennedy's victory in the crucial California presidential primary.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
But moments after he finished speaking, Kennedy was shot in the head from point-blank range by a man named Sirhan Sirhan.
If there's a doctor in the house, I want to see him right here. Everybody else, please stay back. Please stay back.
Hours later, he was dead.
Is there a doctor in the house?
After his funeral in New York, Robert Kennedy's body was carried by train to Washington, where he would be laid to rest near the grave of his slain brother, John. Tens of thousands of admirers lined the tracks to say goodbye. Now, with both Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King gone, it seemed there was no one left to pick up the torch.
Didn't you love the things that they stood for? Didn't they try to find some good? You know, I just looked around and he's gone.
It was only June, but 1968 was already one of the most tumultuous years in U.S. history. The murders of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy unleashed shockwaves of grief and fury. But by summer, another kind of wave was rolling across the American heartland. A tribal movement bound together by sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They were called hippies, and bands like the Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, and Big Brother and the Holding Company were their musical messengers.
What was significant about the year 1968 was that the entire counterculture became known to people across the country. It started around 64 or 65 in San Francisco, and it slowly just reached out like this pool of water racing across the nation.
If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair.
We went to, I think, Grinnell College in Iowa once, in maybe '67. And all the people came to the show in like prom gowns and tuxedos. And then we came back to Grinnell the next year, and they were having like nude love-ins and mud bath parties and acid freakouts and all this sort of thing in just 1 year.
My green tambourine.
In Vietnam, young American soldiers were fighting for their lives. In America, their friends were having the time of their lives. The contrast was staggering.
At the time, I was a 28-year-old rock and roll star. So I was selfish and concerned with who I could get into bed, how the record was doing, where we were going on the road, isn't this fun, and how many drugs I could take. So there's a lot of selfish hedonism going on. At the same time, on a different level, you do care about how the country's going and about how the world's going. But I'd have to say there's an awful lot of what's in it for me.
In reality, it was politics, not rock and roll, that gave the revolution its substance. But music did give it style. The regal elegance of Aretha Franklin, the icy authority of Grace Slick, and the wrenching blues of Janis Joplin were redefining the role of women.
this can't be.
1968 marked the beginning of a feminist revolution, and not just in music.
Grace Slick and Janis Joplin and Aretha Franklin are really contributing to the feminist movement indirectly because they are just as famous and just as important as any male rock and roll star. So you see real artistic equality between men and women as well as between blacks and whites.
Grace Slick and Aretha Franklin sang songs that demanded liberation and respect. Janis went one step further. She lived it.
Tell me, come on. Tell me why. Oh, tell me why. Oh, people, tell me why love. Honey, why love.
If the women were on the verge of just kind of trying to move right up there to the fence and see what was going on, then Janis was big enough, formidable enough to say, it can be done. It's okay. Come on over. You know, so I think that she helped in that sense.
Music, music. From Saigon, this is the American Forces Vietnam Network, where the hits just keep on coming.
Oh, I could hide.
In Vietnam, soldiers were staging a musical rebellion of their own. The Armed Forces Radio Network was tightly controlled, so troops created their own bandit radio stations.
This is a dedication to the United States Army. Army sucks.
Even on the front line, soldiers could send out requests for songs the Army didn't approve of.
I just spun the dials. Lo and behold, here's Midnight Jack broadcasting. Midnight Jack, I'm deep in the jungle. Oh, bad news. Mooney Round, he says, what can I play for you, man? How about some Jimi Hendrix? He's gone for about 30 seconds. I imagine he's putting a reel-to-reel tape on, you know, and here comes Jimi Hendrix.
There must be some kind of way out of here. Say the joker to the thief.
In the summer of '68, fighting in Vietnam was intensifying. Back home in America's heartland, the stage was set for another battle. It was August, and Democrats were gathering in a convention hall in Chicago. On the third night of the Democratic Convention, August 28th, all the tensions and conflicts which had been simmering in America that summer boiled over. When anti-war protesters tried to march to the convention hall, Chicago's police launched a riot of their own.
Night of the nomination of the Democratic Party was just a free-for-all on worldwide television, with young people and others just being bloody senseless.
These police officers were lashing out in their own blind rage. The traditional answer is, if you disagree with me, then I'll beat your ass. And that's the solution they were using. Of course, the issues at play here were way bigger than the policemen and the protesters.
The actual fighting that happened in Chicago in 1968 was class warfare, but not of the kind that we thought that we were conducting. We thought we were upholding the impoverished and the downtrodden in America. In fact, the impoverished and the downtrodden had gotten jobs at the police department and were busting us over the head.
Not only hippies were getting beat up, but reporters like Dan Rather and Mike Wallace were getting beat up by daily security people on the floor of the Chicago Convention.
It wasn't a bad love. I wouldn't have no luck at all.
In one wild night, a generation's romantic dreams of sweeping aside the old order came crashing down in a hard rain of terror and tear gas.
There was a sense that the brutality in Vietnam was coming home, and that what we were seeing in the streets of Saigon, we were now seeing in the streets of the city of Chicago.
I've been down since I began to crawl.
America's mood was turning darker, and so would the music.
I wouldn't have no luck at all.
Next, the movement loses momentum.
It's
a summer's worth of hippie dreams had curdled into a nightmare of violence at the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Now came a season of growing discontent, with pop hits that reflected a souring climate of anxiety and mistrust.
Martin Luther King was shot. Bobby Kennedy was shot. It's a hard time to have faith in the dream or hope in the dream, because they keep picking off the leaders.
The music just got darker across the board. Time Has Come Today by the Chambers Brothers. You know, it sounded like it was, you know, your last chance to make a decision in terms of where you stood, you know. Time has come today, you know, young hearts must go their way. You can't put it off another day, you know, you had to decide.
The presidential campaign turned bitter and joyless, and Republican candidate Richard Nixon took dead aim at the counterculture by promising a return of old-fashioned values of law and order. Election day, November 5th, 1968, polls showed the two leading presidential candidates in a dead heat. But when all the results were in, Richard Nixon had been elected president of the United States. In his victory speech, Nixon promised to bring the country back together. But after all that had happened in 1968, his triumph was a bitter pill for some to swallow.
I could not help but be pissed off. That was the whole My America, right or wrong gang saying, Dick Nixon, he'll fix it for us. Dick Nixon couldn't fix a Kleenex box. And what they were saying was, we're not backing out of this war.
Nixon.
Just weeks after Nixon's victory, the Beatles released a two-record set known as the White Album, filled with music as wide-ranging and undefinable as the year itself. It included a song called Revolution, but instead of a call to arms, John Lennon sang of putting politics aside to work on more personal issues. The song incited a firestorm of controversy.
I haven't slept a wink. I'm so tired. My mind is on the blink.
The social and political earthquakes of 1968 produced plenty of aftershocks. Demonstrations against the war in Vietnam grew larger. The protests often turned violent and sometimes deadly.
I don't know what to do.
But there would never be another year quite like 1968.
You really have to remember that 1968 is the only year since the Depression when people really felt as if America could fall apart.
I think there was a real revolution. I think there was a real violent revolution.
But after all the smoke from that revolution had cleared, it was hard to know who won and who lost. The Vietnam War lasted 7 more years. And to this day, Dr. Martin Luther King's visions of justice and racial harmony have yet to be fulfilled. But back in '68, many songwriters and their fans believed that music would change the world.
In a white room with black curtains near the station.
Others have grown cynical and reject the notion that music ever mattered.
Strobe lights beam, create strings.
The main thing about 60s music, where it reflected our attitude, was its self-importance. And by 1968 or 1969, it thought it was a method of achieving spiritual truth and political justice around the world. This is vaudeville. This is vaudeville. Jugglers don't save the world. Fire eaters don't save the world. People who make parakeets disappear in a handkerchief don't save the world. Why would guitar players save the world?
But if the music of 1968 had only a glancing impact on the dramatic events of the day, its legacy still lingers in the hearts and minds of a generation.
We did make a dream come true for ourselves. And the dream was not about money, and it was not about style. It was about your heart and the way you live, and society and the way we all live together.
We have liftoff.
In late December 1968, 3 American astronauts were launched into space aboard Apollo 8.
Apollo 8, Houston, you are go for staging, over.
Then on Christmas Eve, the crew of Apollo 8 turned their camera toward the Earth.
How high can you fly?
500 million people tuned in to see our world like we had never seen it before.